This is our third series of slides on family theory, and in this set we're going to be looking at three different family theories. And as we do so, we want to keep in mind the questions that we ask, and those questions concern how is marriage defined, what's the parent-child relationship, what's to be saved about this particular theory, what's most central and important to it. So, let's begin. The first of our theories is social conflict theory, and in social conflict theory there are four theorists who are of particular importance. As we look through the lenses here, who do we see but Thomas Malthus, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. Malthus is the individual who realized that population expands exponentially while food production expands arithmetically. So eventually we run out of food. So there's limited resources over which we must then fight in order to survive. Charles Darwin, of course, came up with the survival of the fittest as one of the mechanisms by which Darwinian evolution takes place. Karl Marx described class conflicts, positing a thesis and antithesis resulting in a synthesis, and that social groups are always going to find themselves within conflict over the resources. Finally, Sigmund Freud indicated that much of this conflict actually takes place at a subconscious level. So these are where the roots are philosophically for social conflict theory. Beginning then with those roots, we discover that conflict, in this perspective, is not an evil to be avoided, but a necessity for human progress and development. Without conflict, we don't move forward. The process doesn't happen. History doesn't proceed. And the family, it is noted, has unique structural characteristics that increase the frequency, normality, and intensity of conflict as a component of family life. With that beginning, let's take a look then at the first basic question. What is marriage in this particular view? Well, the marriage relationship is one of balance between individuals who are acting in accordance with their own self-interest or acting in the interest of the relationship. Notice right away what's lacking there is a possibility of actually acting in accordance with the best interests of the partner. Ultimately, social conflict theory finds that it's impossible for the individual to take his or her own well-being out of the equation and act in a truly altruistic fashion. So instead, we simply have these two possibilities: acting in accordance with their own self-interest or acting in the interest of the relationship. What is the parent-child relationship like in social conflict theory? Well, there we find that the parent-child relationship involves interactions based on competition for these scarce resources that we mentioned earlier: material goods, time, money, and affection. Competition provides for the child's well-being as the child learns argumentation, negotiation, and real-world survival skills. In fact, in social conflict theory, the only child is a child who has a disadvantage. That child isn't learning those social conflict skills that will be so necessary for adulthood. Now, there are limits placed upon this, of course. Argumentation, negotiation, real-world survival skills learned in conflict, as long as the conflict is limited in amount, intensity, and the manner of expression. No social conflict theorist is in favor of any kind of abuse, whether we're talking physical or emotional. And so, the child who grows up in an environment where there's plenty about which to have conflict is the child who learns real-world survival skills. So let's look at what there is to keep and what there is to give away in social conflict theory. Well, first of all, a negative that it has is that it is rooted in evolutionary theory, and that creates some difficulties for us. Secondly, it lacks an explanation for altruism or love. Why would anyone do anything if it didn't benefit oneself? So we have difficulty explaining any kind of self-sacrificing actions. It also doesn't deal well with the concept of sin, recognizing that conflict is often an opportunity for sin to display itself in our lives, that many conflicts are unnecessary and are evidence of greed or malice. But there are some things to keep from social conflict theory. It recognizes the likelihood of conflict and therefore presents a very realistic view of what family life is like. And it views conflict as an opportunity for growth. And any good counselor would realize that that certainly must be part of one's perspective in conflict and dealing with families that are going through conflict, that as they proceed, there's plenty of opportunities to grow stronger as a family and to mature in one's exercise of the Christian faith. So what are we going to put into the safe for social conflict theory? Well, the great family values here will be autonomy of the individual and the freedom to work through conflicts, as well as the opportunity to dissolve and reform families as necessary should conflict within the family become abusive. And if we were to discuss this further, here's an interesting thing to think about. How do I handle conflict in my own family situation? What do we do? Who acts as the Supreme Court in the household in social conflict? Well, now it's time to move on to our next family theory, which is called life course theory. Life course theory is really interesting. In fact, it's probably one of my favorites, coming in a close second to structural functionalism, because in life course theory, individuals in families who are that's the center. We look at the individual, but it recognizes that individuals are experiencing three formative effects that take place, and we call these age effects, period effects, and cohort effects. And family members experience these effects differently. What are age effects? They are things that happen to us simply because we are physically aging. The 20-year-old is able to run faster than the 45-year-old. Age effects include such things as losing one's hair. Right now I wear trifocals. That's an age effect. Period effects are something else. A period effect is something that happens ordinarily at a certain stage in life. Adolescence would be called a period of life, so there are certain things that are going to happen when one is an adolescent. Likewise, normally, if you go back 20 or 30 years, people would normally marry in their early 20s, or maybe even late teens. And that was a period effect. One would expect to make that kind of formal commitment and bond during those years. Right now, the period effect for marriage is more like 27 and 28 years of age, as the average age of first marriage has continued to climb in our society. Another period in life is generally when people become grandparents. Ordinarily, that happens in the 40s or 50s. But now notice that period effects can vary considerably. It's possible for someone to become a grandparent in their 30s. It's also possible for someone to become a grandparent in his or her 80s. So period effects, while ordinarily within a certain time frame, actually can move considerably. A first marriage, for example, I have a sister, and her first marriage occurred when she was in her mid-40s. That's way outside the norm, but it happens for many people. And so at that point, she and her husband were newlyweds. This was a first marriage for both. And they were newlyweds, but they were in their mid-40s at that time. Cohort effects are something else again. Cohort effects are events that happen to a generation of young people at a certain very formative stage in their lives that then proceeds to color and describe and perhaps even give a character to that cohort or to that generation. Such events would be, for example, the Challenger when it exploded. school children around the country were watching the Challenger take off because there was a teacher on board. And then the Challenger exploded, and everyone on board was killed. That was an amazing thing, and of course that all of a sudden had an effect on all those children who were watching it. Another event would be for my generation, in particular the assassination of President Kennedy. I was in 5th grade at the time, and when Kennedy was shot, well, the whole country spent the next weekend glued to the television set listening to Walter Cronkite. That had an effect on me in particular, as I viewed leadership, government, and how trustworthy or permanent such institutions might be. Attitudes are formed as cohorts go through life experiences. We all know that there's going to be some shifts and changes as a result of 9/11. There was a group of young people in a very formative stage of life when 9/11 occurred. And those people are now primarily in their late 20s, early 30s. You know, it might be surprising. College students today in 2012 were really pretty young when that occurred. And for that reason, perhaps we're not as much aware of the impact of it. However, those who follow certainly will be. Well, now, back to what's going on here. Family life course theory uses the words trajectory to describe how these age, period, and cohort effects influence the individual. And within a family, then, imagine for a moment you've got fireworks going off from a number of different places. Each one has its own trajectory. Occasionally they intersect. And that is a way of imagining for ourselves or picturing for ourselves how these various life courses will affect people within a family. Family life course theory has some assumptions that it makes as it begins. Assumptions such as that the family is a mirror of society. Where society is going, the family soon follows. They reflect each other. That the family is the nexus of intersecting life courses. This brings us back to the image I shared in the last slide about fireworks going off from different places that intersect at some point. Families develop shared histories, and also that families react to social change. But notice that they react in different ways. And that's because you have individuals in the family who are of different cohorts, who are experiencing different age effects and finding themselves in different periods of their lives. This becomes an explanation for what? For miscommunication between the generations in a household. So let's look at marriage. What's going on in marriage in life course theory? Well, marriage is a relationship that's the story of two intersecting trajectories. I mean, this pretty well describes a lot of the plots of many movies that we might go to see that have romance as the central focus. These trajectories can intertwine with each other, and that's when the relationship develops. Imagine for a moment two lines intersecting and then forming kind of the double helix of the DNA molecule as they intertwine with each other. But then it also means that these trajectories can later on diverge as interests and affections and other elements separate. So that trajectory that came together for a period of time in that winding double helix of the DNA molecule can then unravel and send people off in different trajectories, thus validating a separation that could take place as families fragment. What's happening with the parent-child relationship in life course theory? Well, the parent-child relationship is one that's filled with miscommunication and misunderstanding because of periods, cohorts, and age effects. Through the family, the child attaches meaning to life events. The family becomes the filter through which the child develops interpretive skills. And it's these multiple trajectories that create the family history, and each family's history is going to be unique. Looking at the positives and negatives of this very brief overview of life course theory, as all of our overviews of these theories are, we're just scratching the surface of what's behind each of them. We find this: Life course theory describes the effects of rapid social change on family life. It also emphasizes the uniqueness and the similarity among families, and we find that it documents the generations gap that can exist within a household and within the society itself. Now, those are the positives that we look at. What kind of negatives might there be? Well, it's very descriptive, but it lacks explanatory power. It provides no framework for deciding key issues, though it can certainly map out the terrain about which these issues will be decided. And we find that it limits the power of commitments we make, because it is so open for these trajectories to unravel and unentwine and go their separate ways. We would look at that, at least from a Christian perspective, as a weakness. It's too easy an out. From the perspective of life course theory itself, then, what goes in the safe? What is most important? Well, good communication within the family, respect for each other, though attitudes and beliefs may differ across the generations, and freedom. Freedom to move in and out of relationships. Now we're going to look at our fifth theory regarding family, and that takes us into the field of feminist family theory. Oh, made a mistake here. There's one more slide for life course theory. And the one more slide for life course theory simply asks you to consider these questions. What is my age, period, and cohort? Think about that for yourself. How may the interaction of these effects for yourself differ from others in your household and your family? Now, let's move on to feminist family theory. In feminist family theory, we'd have to say that the major theme, as we look through these lenses, is going to have to do with freedom and personal development. It's very individualistically oriented. And so we find these themes. Economic freedom, particularly how that is necessary and important to women. Reproductive freedom, again, necessary and empowering for women. And then an understanding of the separation of sex from gender. And how do those two things differ? In feminist family theory, it's pointed out that sex is a biological distinction, gender is a social distinction. Sex is a matter of biological plumbing, gender is created by the society around in which people live. We also need to recognize, as we explore feminist family theory, that there are differing levels of feminist theory, some quite moderating and some quite extreme. And the moderating have been very helpful for society in general, as greater equality and opportunity is being provided for women. Whereas extreme feminist theory can sometimes be quite edgy and in fact sometimes appear to many to go over the edge. Are there any assumptions then that feminist family theory would want to make regarding the family? Is there some kind of structure we should look for? And the answer to that is actually no. There's no assumptions that should be made about the family. We shouldn't look for a particular structure because, as many feminists would look at it, to define the family would already begin to oppress it. It would be society's action of setting the parameters of what family can be rather than letting family emerge out of relationships themselves. Now, this can sometimes take an extreme view, and such an extreme view was expressed by Shulamith Firestone in 1993 when she said, "For women and children to be liberated, current forms of motherhood and family must be abolished." So there's where freedom and liberation takes such an extreme view that we find motherhood itself no longer being a valued aspect of our lives together. So what are the feminist family theory assumptions then concerning marriage? Well, we already said that no assumptions should be made, but nevertheless there are some. And the first is that marriage is a social construction, and as such can be reconstructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed as the society would deem suitable. Certainly this is something that our whole society today is in quite a conflict over, regarding how shall marriage be defined and who can marry who. If marriage is viewed as something that was established at the beginning by God, we have no authority or power to change it. It is a relationship between a man and a woman. If marriage, on the other hand, is simply a social construction that is agreed upon by the majority, then we're free to create anything that might seem suitable or appropriate for our given time and age. And feminist family theory certainly ties strongly into the second and not the first. Marriage is also looked at best when it is egalitarian, and by egalitarian we mean a 50-50 shared set of responsibilities, rather than male dominance and female subservience. So an egalitarian marriage is going to be viewed as the best. Now, here is where moderating feminists have been very helpful, because they point out that many times in the past, household chores have been primarily the woman's responsibility, whereas the man was primarily responsible for being the provider. Now, that worked well if the woman was primarily in the home and the man was the only one working. But when both are employed full-time, studies have shown that the woman still winds up with more of the household chores than the man. Now, granted, this has changed somewhat over the last several decades. You go back far enough and, it's like 70-30 in terms of women doing the household chores and what the men do. More recent studies have brought it closer together, more like 60-40 or even 55-45. Nevertheless, because so much of a family's nurturing, and again here we get back to structural functionalism, so much of a family's nurturing is going to be coming through the mother's role. It appears that in the home, the mother still has more of the workload than the father. And so achieving this level of egalitarianism is still quite difficult. Marriage is also looked as an institution that needs to change. But should it be changed by more equality, or should it be changed by more highly esteeming the uniqueness of women? Here, feminist family theory itself splits over how to answer. Should we go the equality route, saying there's little difference between men and women, they can exchange their roles quite easily? Or should women be elevated by esteeming their uniqueness vis-a-vis men? Interesting question. How would we answer that for our And now the parent-child relationship. In feminist family theory, the parent-child relationship is viewed as not as significant as it would be in some other theories. Because parenting is viewed as something that's put on or placed upon families, something that's not necessarily going to be the family's responsibility. In fact, the parenting could really be the responsibility of the community. Whereas the parents are producing the children physically, it's the community that actually raises and educates children from feminist family view perspective. And that's because the nuclear family itself is a deprived environment. Too few relationships, too little environmental stimulation, whereas the community can provide so much more. And finally, feminist family theory in terms of parent-child relationships then ties in very closely to multicultural models that extend the family. That is to say, the development of multi-generational households as a very positive thing, and the recognition of the role of fictive kin. And fictive kin is the uncle who's really not an uncle, but he's just close to the family and kind of becomes part of the family. I remember in our first parish, we had a surrogate grandmother who lived right next door. And when our third child was born, she was the one who came over in the middle of the night to be with the other two children while my wife and I went to the hospital for the birth of Christy. And in terms of being kin, now it's 28 years later, and in a road trip we took to St. Louis earlier this year, we stopped by to visit Grandma Mary. And in fact, along with us was the biological grandma, Dorothy, who is also quite a good friend now of the fictive kin grandma, Mary, and we had a wonderful visit together. There's something to be said, again, a positive about feminist family theory when it extends the family in such a way. So what are we going to keep from feminist family theory, and what's its positives and what's its negatives? Well, let's take a look. Feminist theory works toward equality of work and responsibility, which is a matter of fairness. And feminist theory upholds the role of the extended family and community responsibility, because regardless of how one views that statement, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a community to put together an environment where there is sufficient resources available for families to use, as well as school systems and other venues for the maturing and the support of growing children. What else? Well, feminist theory loses any sense of community norms, because you really can't develop a norm, because that would be to impose something upon the family. One simply has to wait and see what kind of family emerges in the situation. And feminist family theory, in our theological perspective, has difficulties because there's no place for mutual submission. And there I'm thinking of Ephesians chapter 5, the passages that are so frequently read at weddings. The verse that begins, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then goes on to say, wives, submit to your husband. And then later on, husbands, love your wives, and places upon the husband that extreme role of needing to give up his life for the benefit of the wife, just as Christ gives up his life for the church. Well, again, feminist theory has great difficulty with this concept of mutual submission. So here we are at our last slide regarding feminist family theory, and all of our theories for that matter. But what would we conclude about feminist family theory? What's going to be put in the safe? What's most valuable and important for feminist family theory? Well, the family value of freedom of choice and of personal advancement. Those are central. You see, the emphasis on the individual in feminist family theory. And so here's a question for discussion, if you have someone with whom you can discuss it. Are there ways in which my household arrangement is unfair? Are there ways to address the problem? Something to think about. How are duties divvied up? I don't cook, at least not much. It's pretty rare for me to cook. But then again, my wife doesn't manage the automobiles or mow the lawn. So we've got some fairly rigid distinctions there. Nevertheless, in other areas, we share things quite a bit. She keeps track of laundry, but I like to do the ironing. Why do I like to do the ironing? Because there, after having done the ironing, I can actually see something that was all crinkled straightened out. Very few things in life work so well.